So let me introduce who I really am. I'm Dave DeVries, and I work for the Department of Defense, CIO, Ms. Terry Takai. And it is indeed an extreme pleasure being here today. And I apologize, I got the frog in my throat from the past couple of days here, so we'll just kind of make through this thing here. So how many here are from federal agencies? If I can just pull the, okay. And then the rest, I guess, are what I call from the vendor community. So good, we're about maybe 50-50 here. If you're not familiar with the Department of Defense, it's a rather small agency, a rather homogeneous agency. We are comprised principally of the Secretary of Defense and his cabinet level up on top. Beneath there are 3 military departments, air, land, and sea. Very homogeneous again. We have agencies down below there. We have about 26, 27 agencies. And all of these are given authorities by Congress to do things that they need to do to execute their business. So this is not unlike what Stephen Wokel talked about from a federal side. How do I bring rationality to this chaos here? And we're not chaos by design. We're there because of how we got there. 1947, we split up the Department of Defense. We made the Department of Defense. We brought in the jointness. We changed things. In the mid-'80s, we had a revolutionary idea. Let's allow people to have facsimile machines in their offices. It was a novel world. Then you had to figure out who was authorized to punch the numbers on it and actually send something. Shortly thereafter, we came up with email, and you had the haves and the have-nots as to who could have their email address. And could they actually get it at their desk, or did they have to walk down the corridor someplace? Then we came along and we said, well, we need to secure information. We need information out to the battlefield. I need to host it out there someplace. And for, as she said, 29 years, I perfected that art of how do I get around the bureaucracy, how do I enable success, how do I buy things, how do I construct things, how do I lash things together on the fly? Because at the end of the day, the people at the pointy edge of the spear need the information there. And my God, we got it done. And now comes along 20th century or the 21st century, and we're sitting here facing budget cuts. We're actually facing a bigger crisis. That's the need to understand and share the information we have. The budget crisis will be resolved by tackling the first part of it. If you just focus on reducing stuff to meet a budget limit, you'll not solve the problem of what information do I have and how do I share it. So I would offer to you this cloud strategy has to focus on the information that we have, how do I share it, not in what can I get cheapest, fastest, and just do it. Because we've got 40 years of experience doing it that way. And that's where Stephen Wokel talked about the whole policy and the strategy now is how do we lay this thing out and begin to rationalize it? Throughout the Department of Defense, over 3.5 million users out there. Every system we have today employs IT. The only thing that does not, I think, is the meals ready to eat in that pouch. But even they have a barcode on it, so I would infer to you that they do, in fact, employ IT. We track things all over the world for humanitarian reasons, for disaster preparedness, to actually engage. That's what the Department of Defense does. As I talked about, there are 3 departments, there are 4 services, and close to 26, 27 agencies out there. Then that does not include the partners that we have to interface in with. Coast Guard, all the federal agencies. There's nowhere that Department of Defense goes, I don't care what the scale is, that there is not a mission partner sitting there that we have to interface back with. Nowhere, at any time. We're getting to the world of I need to go out there and I need to connect back into my information, and I need to be able to connect to it securely, know that I'm getting the information that I'm authorized to get to and getting it reliably. So we're going into this structure here. Across the top there, you see the various devices there. We're moving from you're assigned this desktop, and it sits here in your office space, to, I'm not going to say bring your own device, but we're opening up the aperture of the mobile devices that are coming on the market today, that we know how to manage them securely. We know what government data is going to go into them, and we can protect that. So that's what we're going to on the far right-hand side there. And it's changing. It is changing the culture inside the department there. I would tell you, and I'll jump ahead, not to a slide, but to a thought here, with this many in the vendor community, where we need help on, not only in Department of Defense, but also in the government space, is how do we contract for this capability? That's a new territory, and we'll discuss that more in some of the slides coming up there. We talk about agile development, and I think Kevin started off this morning by saying we need to go with smaller increments and put them together there. As Steve pointed out, our culture does not promote that. Our culture does not promote that. Our systems do not promote that. Why? In Department of Defense, I have to have my requirement. It has to be well-founded, well-discussed, well laid out, 2 years in advance. And I go through all kinds of process to get it approved, all the way up to our board of directors called Congress. I have to have that requirement laid out as a program of record, which also looks in the out years and how do I sustain it. That is very much geared toward the old way of I need to buy a tank, a ship, an Air Force, or an airplane. It is not about I need to create a capability that involves different software and components out there to enable a technology or a capability there. It's changing here. How do I do that? The acquisition rules that we have say we can do it, but in practice, how do you actually do it? Where's that risk excuse me, the risk management out there? Who makes the decision is I can go ahead with this thing for the next 6 months, I expect to see something, and then I can use it or I turn it off again. We're getting there, but it's a long, slow process. And then again, what's hitting all of our doors is the advanced cybersecurity threats out there. There is no industry out there today, as Steve talked about, if you're connected to the network, that you're not at risk. The challenge from within Department of Defense, a lot of our information is not what I would call public-facing information. It's being churned, it's being used to inform decision makers. It has to be protected there. We have partners in on those things at different segments, but how do we move those things around there? Slide, please. We've recently published the Department of Defense Cloud Strategy. Here are the 4 main tenets there. On the left-hand side, you see where we're coming from. It's an island of chaos. It's not by design. It's by righteousness of how we got there. People built systems, and then we said, oh, I can do this with this system. If I link the data through this interface here, I can now share it across the board here. We spent years figuring out how to make 2 wires talk to 4 wires. We're beyond that now. Now we're into the stage of what information do I have here? How is it tagged? How do I then securely share it then with my mission partner, whether it be a different country or a different government agency or even a different unit in my Department of Defense organization there. We talked about a lot about the federal data center consolidation initiative. It's one of our planks for going to the cloud. As the owner of this responsibility within inside DoD-CIO, I can tell you that 2 years ago, we knew everything we had to know about Department of Defense and my data centers. I knew there were 762 of them. I knew that. Within a year, it was more than that. Now, part of it was we kind of changed the rules of what made up a data center. But it's also is we get better understanding of how to report things and how do you see things. Why? Because that chaos that is on the left-hand side there, those are all procured and hooked together and managed in some manner. But nobody knows the total picture. whether you're in the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps, or DOD. We're moving away from that to where I can see the stuff and I know the stuff. I have to know what my assets are there. So if I have more than 1,900 data centers now, and I'm consolidating that, what am I going down to? We've got a strategy, and I'll talk about that coming up there. But now I begin to get a breadth of how big the problem is. If I have a data center, what's inside it? All kinds of stuff. Some of that stuff is 40 years old. Some of that stuff is probably 6 months old. It's got old technology, it's got old software, it's got new technology and new code. I can't just turn off something. You may have read in the newspapers in the past couple of days that the DOD and VA have changed their strategy on the moving ahead to the electronic health record. Again, it's the evolving thing of how do we put this thing together. Why? In Department of Defense, and I having been a member there, my medical records have been in the cloud, so to speak, for more than 15 years. Everywhere I went around the world, my data got to me. Now, there were some situations I couldn't get to the data because I was not electronically connected to it, but my data was there as far as I was concerned and the medical care. When I retired, if I went to the West Coast, my data would be shipped out there. And after 2 years, if I moved back to the East Coast, it would be shipped out there. Well, why are we moving my records around? Why am I making copies of Dave DeVries and shipping him around the world? I don't need to do that. So that was our effort the past 2 years of sharing the data. And that's the success that we've had in the past couple of years, is how do I link that thing together with the official data records, as we call them, inside the medical piece with the VA piece. And that's what we're going to try and establish more of this enterprise cloud platform here, where I know where the data is, and then what are the apps that go on top. The challenge is, if I look at the Department of Defense and its size and scope, it's a different size and scope than what VA is. There are moving pieces, there are going into combat pieces, there's hospitals back here, there's a different age generation than a normal vet population there. The veteran sites are known hospitals there. So we're moving at different paces because of our complexity and sizes, but we've got to make sure that we have usable applications that go back to the same data sources. And that's the only change that we're focusing on now, is how do I replace some of the legacy stuff of the DOD in a more rapid, agile fashion now that we got the data about isolated through there. Slide, please. We talked about data center consolidations. We got 1,900 of them. We've gone through, and we're going through a governance process now where we've asked the service to go back and look at their data centers that they have there. I have them into a single repository somewhere in the cloud that tells them what they are. We're beginning to get the data out of there of what's there and how to rationalize them. If you look at the earth from on top, I have many different installations that are bounded by fence and wires, and there are appropriated dollars going into there to sustain them. I call that an installation, whether it be managed by Air Force, Navy, or Army. There's an owner there, and we paid for the roads to go on there and the buildings and that kind of stuff. Same true with the IT infrastructure. Until now, the IT infrastructure was really whoever brought whatever they wanted to have if they lived on that base. So classic case, Fort Belvoir here, it's owned by the Army, but I have Air Force there, I have Navy there, I have other organizations there. Many, over half of the percentage of circuits going in there are not controlled through a single source there. It's all controlled by the owner who bought the source. Only AT&T, Sprint, and a few other ones really know what's going through there. Why? Because of how we bought the stuff. There's no centralization on top of it. So we're going to be declaring what I would call the DoD core data center. And that will have a known structure to it. We've already published the reference architecture on it. It's got the security zones in it to include the public-facing zones, if you will. And these standards are now gone out, and we're nominating which ones are going to become the core data centers. They are not all going to be run by DISA, but we'll compete them through the 4 services and DISA But again, they're going to be run mostly by IT providers and or vendors. And you'll see RFIs that go out for those things there. The installation I talked about would be mainly governed by your IPNs in the center line there. That's, at every base, I will need to have a building that I protect, that I secure, that I put environmental controls on, and I put a lot of data inside there. It could be commercially run, it could be privately run, but it's going to be there on a base. Those are IPNs. A lot of that information stays locally to the base. It does not need to go globally after that. And of course, we had the tactical situation. You could call that a ship, you could call that a brigade combat team, and there are many other examples there. Slide, please. So here are the apps and the other things that we're going into the common computing. You know, Steve talked about infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. We're moving aggressively into these here. Along the bottom, you saw the type of CDCs and TPNs. Most of these apps and so forth, if they're global in nature, will be going into the core data centers. And if they're local, they'll be going into the IPNs and or the tactical piece there. You may have also heard through the news and so forth, this thing called that DoD is moving toward a joint information environment. That's the effort that the cloud computing and mobile computing and everything else is falling underneath. That's what's enabling us to bring to the warfighter on any device that's authorized their information that they need at the point where they need to have it there. Slide, please. I would tell you our biggest challenge is not just consolidating the 1,900 data centers. It's understanding what's inside there. The Navy went through, they reduced from 3,000 or from 30,000 down to 15,000. A 50% reduction. They still have a ways to go yet. Army's undertaking the same thing now. Because only when you start to rationalize what your applications are, and then you look at them and say, well, what am I going to keep? What am I going to sunset? If I'm going to sunset it, I have to, no kidding, put a date on the mark and say to the owner, you're turning it off on this date here or by this date here. How are you going to replace that capability with something else? And that's where our performance is rather spotty. We're good at saying, I need to keep this 20-year-old system alive. Here's what I want to move it to. This is a wonderful thing, and I have all kinds of, and I love you vendors out there, but you all come in and promise me the world, but our delivery is not so good at bringing home that capability. And so suddenly at the last minute, we say, oh, this is not working, so I need to keep alive this thing for 4 more years, and now I'm paying to bring people off from retirement properly just to keep the thing alive because only they know how to keep the thing ticking. Last year, we reviewed over 2,100 business systems at the DoD level. And I would tell you, I was amazed at the number of systems that do personnel and finance and da-da-da, just name your tune. And yes, we are very big and very complex, but why do we need to have so many? Why can't I move to something more in the cloud and where I use apps here? We're getting there, but we have to figure out together, how do I do it without making it an ERP system? Because Steve didn't talk about that too much, but if I label something as an ERP right away, that's a high risk. It's a high risk for the organization who wants to promote it and to get permission by Congress to do it, and it's a high risk for the vendor who wants to put it together there. But together we got to figure out how to do these things to get this thing rolled out. Rehost, once I go through and rationalize the apps, I can maybe think about moving it from this place to that place as I begin to consolidate my data centers. Contrary to popular opinion, just because I can find the IP here and find the IP there, I just can't move it across. It takes time, it takes engineering. And you find out the things that were connected to the old one when you start to move or take it apart and move it across. And it takes money and time to move things and to consolidate things. Refactor. We're also making mandatory now more and more services that these applications will use as they perform their business function. For example, identity. No longer do I want business systems, warfighting systems, to say, oh, Dave DeVries needs to be a user here, create one for him. You will now consume the standard identity that we have on the NIPR side and the classified side and use that ubiquitously throughout there. So there are some services now that we've mandated, and the cloud's going to help us move to that, to where you can share those things. And then finally, spending the time to rewrite the whole applications there. Slide, please. So we talked about, Steve talked about the FedRAMP program. We're a strong advocate for that, but that gets us to the low and medium there, and we're cutting our eye teeth there, and it's very important. From a department perspective, though, that cybersecurity certification and accreditation, that's change management. Where do you draw the boundary lines now at the cloud? Is it at the app? Is it at the service? Is it at the data? Who's going to take responsibility for the protection of that and make sure the right controls are in place? And now we've got to figure out what the right controls are. Too hard, the data will not go. Too loose, you don't know where that data is going to go. That's our challenge here. And together, we've got to work on that thing. And I would tell you, and Steve kind of talked to it in his remarks there, we're going to do this in an iterative fashion, and it's not going to be risk-free. There are people today that are starting to take risk on putting out their data, and that's why we're starting out to the low to medium, because we may make mistakes in there. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay to make a mistake as long as the national defense of the United States is not put at risk. But I don't think for low to medium data sets that that's going to be a huge problem there. So let's learn from our mistakes and then keep on going from there. The whole cyber detection and mitigation, I would tie that back into that one there too. What's interesting is we're coming up more and more in a collaborative session now with industry on how to do this. Because a threat against the banking is probably the same threat against the Department of Defense or against the Department of Agriculture or any other one there. How do we share that stuff? It used to be that the health industry was unique by itself and that they had to worry about HIPAA. Dave DeVries now is an entity. I have a medical record. I have personal identification information out there. So we have to factor that into almost everything that we do there, because it's not coming down to not the system, but the data. And I would tell you, I put Dave DeVries at bigger risk when I had to put my Social Security number into 5 different systems out there from my home just to tell them who I was, than if I had a centralized identity that was somehow protected through secure means there. Slide, please. This is where we're going to. We've got offerings now. I think I got a slide, broker slide coming up there. The mobile work and deployed in home. So the mobile one, we're moving out with a RFP now on the street for that. You'll see that coming out to provide that as a managed device services. How do we write that? How do we fund it? How do we protect it? That's going to be our challenge. Come ahead.